Hare Krishna. Welcome back to the 50 years, now 55 years actually, series that will soon be finished. But we're on part 37, talking about the time frame between, we're now up to the present, so we're almost done. Between 2020 and 2024, so this is continued. I've already spoken on this time frame and probably have one or two more to do, so but then that will be done and hopefully it's useful to someone. But let me just offer my prayers first. Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Vistaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Vicharane Nirvishesha Srinivadi Paskachade Satarne Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shrivas Adi Gaura Bhaktivinda Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripasinya Vyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Okay, so we are now, let me think, it's funny because now it's closer to the end, but I can't remember the dates and the years as well as I did. I guess my short-term memory is not as good as my long-term. But anyway, somewhere 2022, 23, it was the Kartik Parikrama. And, as always, being in Vrindavan is, wonderful. But, it is getting more and more challenging due to, the increase in the traffic and just the craziness. Whew. But, still, it's really a great blessing to be in the Dham, and you can still feel it. But I just want to mention, because I've talked about the Parikrama in previous ones, I won't talk about it, but I wanted to mention something that happened during this time, which was kind of a big deal for me. I was sitting under a tree at the MVT. I was talking to a friend, waiting for Madhava's Kirtan, which is really a highlight there in Vrindavan. Every afternoon he does his beautiful Kirtans on the grass at the MVT and in the garden. And so I'm just sitting there, and then suddenly, out of the blue, I just felt very strange. It was like my brain just stopped working. It's like short-circuited. And, it's very, very hard to explain that feeling. And, I knew that something very bad was happening, but I couldn't find any words to explain it. I just, it's like my brain shut down and, no connections to, bringing out the words, and I suddenly felt totally uncoordinated, out of balance, and weak, and my vision was strange, and I thought, well, I thought I must be having a stroke, but I didn't lose consciousness, but I knew something was very wrong. And I did manage to say to, my friend, something wrong. And I guess I looked very pale and disorientated, so that, she managed to help me to go to her apartment. And, it didn't last for a really long time, but it was like even when it was over, I couldn't get back to normal. And so, my friends started coming around and trying to figure out what to do with me. They thought I must be having or have had a stroke, and that, they wanted to take me to the hospital. And you know, I was just feeling like I was watching a movie. Everything was just very, very far away, and I just kept shaking my head, no, 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 no hospital, no, no, no. And you know, so I'm very grateful to my dear friends. I think especially Vishesha. She managed to get me back to the Kirtan ashram where I had been staying, and she stayed up watching me, and all I wanted to do was go to sleep, and they kept saying, no, 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 you're not supposed to go to sleep, you know. But anyway, obviously I lived, but it was a horrible experience. And you know, the next morning I went to the hospital and had the tests and all the things, and they concluded that I had a TIA, or a temporary ischemic attack. And it looks like a stroke, but it's temporary, and it doesn't necessarily do any permanent damage. And there's really not much you can do about it other than taking blood thinners to you know, try to avoid a repeat of it. But the main concern is that sometimes TIAs are followed by a, you know, major stroke. So of course that would, you know, keep me on my toes, constantly chanting, is it going to happen again? Is it going to happen again? You know, and you know, I'm only bringing it up just, you know, because this is like real life. You know, we talk the philosophy, and I can give a class and everything, but you know, how does it work in real life? You know, this is an example of how, you know, everything in our life can change in an instant without any warning. That, you know, awareness, we hear it, but you know, when you realize, I am just so fragile. And you know, Srila Prabhupada liked to say, you know, that we're just, you know, our situation here in this material world, it's you know, it's just like a drop of, we're like little drops of water on the lotus leaf, and just, you know, precariously floating there until, you know, we roll off. So an experience like this, it makes these kind of verses really come to life. You know, it's a lived experience of our mortality. And even of our bodily functions, you know, the things that we just take for granted every moment. You know, there's all these millions of things happening, you know, that the blood pumping through our veins, and the blinking of our eyes, and the functioning of our brain. And there's just so much that's going on every second within our own body that we have no control over, and that we take for granted. It's very miraculous what's going on every second. And that any of it or all of it can just be taken away in an instant. We don't own anything, even our bodies, you know, that people like to say, oh, my body, my choice, or whatever, you know. It's not your body, really. And you know, it can be very scary, or it can be a real impetus to, you know, detach and to take more shelter, and just to really realize how fragile our life is. You know, whatever we have, just the ability to walk, to talk, to see, to think, it's all just on loan, and we don't own or control it. And so, you know, this understanding, it tends to increase more and more with age, you know, as, you know, we're experiencing things. Like now I'm having a lot of trouble just walking due to, you know, very painful arthritis and fibromyalgia and, you know, things. And you just start to see, you know, you think, I mean, we talk the philosophy, but somehow we think we're going to go on just as we've always gone on. You know, Maya's so strong, you know, and as, you know, famously George Harrison saying, you know, it's not always gonna be this way. All things must pass. It's a great song. You know, so these kind of experiences, which most of us will have at some point in our life, you know, it is Krishna's way of preparing us, warning us, you know, our time is limited, you know. And Srila Prabhupada, you know, because he was elderly, you know, so he was always encouraging this, you know, even amongst very young people, this sense of intense urgency. And Prabhupada felt that and lived that. And, you know, it's just so easy to become complacent. So, you know, this experience, the TIA, it was a good lesson. Unfortunately, you know, often what happens is when we're out of danger, it's so easy to forget the lessons. But anyway, we try. So now, so back to Mayapur, back TOVP is really moving ahead during these years. You know, the chakra was installed on the top, and then some pujari rooms were opened. Then deity of Srila Prabhupada was installed, and puja was begun for Prabhupada there. I guess this is a way of moving towards, you know, gradually towards opening. And then, you know, in 2024, then the Nrsingadev wing was going to be opened, although Nrsingadev didn't move there. But, you know, I guess it's just their way of starting to make it function, that it's gradually moving forward. And, you know, these are all, you know, really significant milestones that many devotees, you know, have worked very, very hard, you know, to accomplish. Yet, being the skeptic I am, I continue to have very serious concerns about whether, you know, whether the infrastructure needed for the cities surrounding the TOVP will also be developed, and whether we will have the mature leadership required to run it in an exemplary way, and whether the development of a healthy community will become a, you know, significant priority. You know, all the focus is pretty much on the TOVP, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. But in any case, there's certainly nothing I can do at this stage of my life other than just really fervently pray, and I do daily, that, you know, Mahaprabhu will send whoever or whatever is needed to successfully develop this project so that it will truly honor Srila Prabhupada and his vision, you know, and the vision he had for Sridham Mayapur. It is amazing what Srila Prabhupada's vision was, you know, at that time. It's just amazing. So now I'm going to have to move on to something I'd rather not talk about, something horrific that happened in 2021, which most devotees are aware that there was some very, very disturbing revelations of abuse, you know, that came to light. So I can't avoid talking about it, as, you know, I live here in Mayapur, and I was involved in some very small way. And, you know, I am reluctant to discuss it because, of course, it's a volatile topic, and that, you know, whatever you say it's not going to please someone. It's sort of a damned if you do and damned if you don't topic. But these events have had such a devastating effect on so many that to for me to ignore it would be ridiculous. I'm not trying to give some candy-coated vision of history, just telling my experiences, that's all. So, you know, it's not my intention to explain it or judge it or give answers to why it happened, or, you know, the situations that arose are just way too complex to address in any kind of cursory fashion. You know, those things that came to light, they are far-reaching, and they're complex and multi-layered and even multi-generational. You know, it's really not just about one thing. It's about so many things. It's not just about one person or one school, you know, but, you know, hundreds of people affected over time. You know, it's really about child care and protection, and also about leadership and institutional integrity, and it's about education in general. It's about mental health, and it's about philosophy misapplied. And so, you know, understanding it all is extremely difficult, and dealing with it is ongoing. It's not a past experience. So, you know, I can only attempt to share as honestly as possible my own small experiences, and perhaps some thoughts about, you know, what we can learn, or, you know, some suggestions that, however limited they may be. But just first, before talking about it, I want to give a little background for those who don't know, you know, about Mayapur and about particularly the girls' school here. Because much of what happened was related to the girls' school in Mayapur. Officially it was called Sri Anasuya Vidyamandal, but, you know, most everybody said the girls' school. And it was opened as a day school around 2003 or 4, I'm not sure. And, you know, with the intention of training young girls in, you know, Vedic ways. I don't know where the original idea came from. Perhaps Bhaktividyapurna. For sure, he was closely involved with developing it from the onset. And this did raise eyebrows, but many parents were eager for it, and also many young girls eager for it. And, you know, on the surface, it looked like a nice environment and a nice vision. The headmistress that was chosen to lead the school, you know, also raised eyebrows. Because she was, I think, somewhat new to Mayapur, and young and single, I think in her early 20s maybe. Or, you know, I suspected, well, maybe she's seen as someone who would be easy to mold into being a kind of ideal example. And, you know, personally, I had my doubts from the start, but, you know, I have doubts about many things. You know, she seems too young and inexperienced, and, you know, I was seeing that there weren't any really senior women involved. So, you know, I observed with my skeptical eye. And I did note that, you know, it looked a little culty. You know, the girl seemed a little bit robotic. And they just seemed so kind of overly anxious to please their headmistress. You know, it was like they almost worshipped her. And, you know, it seemed strange to me, and Bhaktividyapurna's involvement seems strange to me also. Although, it seemed like he was at a distance, but, how do we know unless you're in there in that school, and it was a closed environment for good reasons. But, I had to say that it appeared that the girls, they were doing a lot of really interesting things and wonderful services, and they seemed to be really enjoying it. And there were other, there were nice devotee teachers involved, and many parents and seniors were really very supportive of the school. So I just thought, as I do often, who knows? The girls look happy. I just thought, well, different strokes for different folks. It kind of rubbed me, a lot of things sort of rubbed me the wrong way. But, that's not uncommon for me. I was just trying to keep my fault-finding tendency in check. But over the years, there were others, other devotees who started to have concerns about the school and about, I don't want to say Maharaj, Bhaktividyapurna, or now anyway, I'll call him Bhaktividyapurna. His involvement, and, finally some complaints were actually made, and I think 2 investigations took place as a result of it. The first one, from what I understand, I don't know details, it just seemed like, it was kind of a slap on the wrist. But eventually the school was closed around maybe 2015, approximately. Yet, there was a lot that was left unclear to many of us in the community and about what happened and why, but, it was closed. And then, so now we're up to 2021, I think the summer of 2021. One day, a married couple came to my apartment. They wanted to speak to me. Both of them had previously been involved in the girls' school from its onset. I will call her M. I don't want to use the proper names of people. I'll just call her M. She was a student, and she eventually became an assistant, and I think even did some teaching. And her husband, R, was a disciple of Bhaktividyapurna and a former Gurukul student. And he used to help out with the maintenance of the girls' school sometimes, as far as I know. Maybe he taught a bit. But anyway, I've known them, not intimately, but as part of the community since they were, little kids. And now they're, I think in their early 30s. And so what they revealed to me was a real shock. I think most of this has been spread online, so I don't think it's a breach of confidentiality to speak about it. But, M explained that Bhaktividyapurna had touched her in extremely inappropriate ways on more than one occasion. So this had happened, maybe, I should maybe figure out the year, but maybe 15 years ago, prior, and the school had been closed for maybe 7 or 8 years. But until this time, she had not revealed it to anyone, even her husband. So, this was very, I was really shocked. Perhaps naively, I had, of course, known about the abuse cases that had, taken place in 70s, 80s, maybe into the 90s. But in all of the cases that I was aware of until that time, Bhaktividyapurna had not been charged with sexual abuse. he had been charged with physical and psychological abuse, although there were suspicions that there was more. But this had all occurred at the boys' school. So, I don't know, I just always thought, you know, that he was perhaps gay. I don't know. So it surprised me that he was involved with a girl, and especially this girl. You know, at that time, I didn't have the slightest doubt that what she told me was true. I'm just telling my impressions. First, because of her really impeccable character. You know, just since she was a little girl, she was just so much loved in the community. She's an innocent, intelligent, sincere, devotee girl, you know, and there's just no doubt in my mind about that. And, you know, even as she spoke, I thought, oh, some things clicked into place in my mind, because I had heard long ago, that she had some very serious health issues, so much so that she had to leave the country to get treatment in the West. And, you know, now, you know, and she's so young and, you know, a healthy girl, and, you know, I wonder what's happening there. And now it made sense to me that this must have been a result of the incredible stress and pain and uncertainty and confusion that this untold secret, you know, caused her. So, and, you know, I also knew that she had absolutely nothing to gain by bringing this up. You know, rather, she had a lot to lose. You know, she knew that throwing out this, you know, informational bomb, you know, would cause havoc and more pain and more uncertainty to herself and her family and friends, and, you know, it would cause a huge upheaval, and it would impact the lives of so many. And she knew, you know, that maybe, you know, some people would hate her, doubt her, blame her, or, you know, and that it would be humiliating and it would be embarrassing. But still, she and her husband were now willing to take that leap. And, you know, telling the truth when truth needs to be told, however difficult that might be, that is a very brave act. And it's something that many victims are unable to do, because it's very, very hard to do, because you have to bring this horrible thing to life again. You have to relive the trauma. It's really something you would rather, you know, either continue to deny or forget, and which you really would prefer that other people don't know about, you know. You know, and, you know, some people were wondering, well, why she waited so long to tell about this, you know. Anyone that is curious, you know, you should know that this is very, very common for victims to delay disclosing abuse. It's not at all surprising that it took so many years to confront this ugly truth, you know, because it's scary. What will the abuser say? Is he going to deny it? How will your family deal with it? How will the community react? Will people believe me? Will people hate me? You know, there can be a lot of shame or guilt involved. And victims, you know, they often struggle with whether they were responsible in some way, or they'd done something wrong, or, you know, maybe I'm exaggerating, and, you know, even maybe I'll be responsible for destroying the abuser's life, you know. You know, so the possible repercussions in this situation were just huge, you know. So I really have to bow and offer my respects to this young woman and her husband who had the courage to come forward, especially now, you know, so many, you know, married women with children, And, you know, so at that time, at this discussion we had, you know, it was clear that this case should be brought to the CPO, and, you know, we talked about how to do it, and they had told one or two other senior people, and, you know, everyone was encouraging them to go forward, which they did immediately. And, you know, of course, we talk about confidentiality, but, you know, that is a real hard thing to have in such a society as we have. And so it didn't take long for the news of this to spread, and causing, you know, a variety of backlash and divisiveness, some in support of what she said, and some in disbelief and anger, or trying to protect the Gurukula or Bhakti-Vidyapurna. But then next, as a result of bringing this news out, very soon another accusation came out. You know, and it was out on the it was available for, you know, anybody to read, from the headmistress of the school, who I'll call Shri. And she accused Bhakti-Vidyapurna of having sexual relations with her in graphic detail. And, you know, all this just sent shockwaves through families, communities, schools. And, you know, just she's now married and has children, and her husband is a disciple of Bhakti-Vidyapurna, and he was a former head of the Gurukul. And, you know, so he didn't know about this either until now, you know. And on top of it, M and R were the brother and sister-in-law. So I'm just bringing this up not to like be gossipy, but to show how complex this situation, you know, was becoming. And then next came a barrage of reactions and accusations from former students of the girls' school, accusing the headmistress, Shri, of varieties of psychological and emotional abuse. And they were not, you know, so sympathetic to her declaration of victimhood. You know, they believed it happened, but they were more disturbed by how she had treated them and the effect it had had on their life. So, you know, first you see the powerful, you know, repercussions that come when one person comes forward. It has, you know, often a domino effect, and it gives others the strength and permission to speak up, which often then opens just, you know, huge can of worms. So, you know, these reports came in from the girls. Of course, they're, you know, I didn't see all of them, but I did hear and see some of it, and it was very eye-opening and very devastating to hear. You know, but these girls are not going to stay quiet now. So it had taken them years to even begin to process, or to even have the words to understand what had happened. So, you know, again, I applaud their bravery. And again, I didn't doubt at all what they said. Now, to be fair, I will also add that there are girls that went to that school that loved that school, and the teacher, the headmistress, and didn't have the same experiences. Now, this is how things, they become complicated, because it's not one thing, it's many things, And I can only report my own experiences of what I heard or saw. That I'm not trying to tell what's right or wrong. But their accusations were full of descriptions that are just classic manipulative behavior. And these are often subtle things that people don't necessarily notice unless they're trained to see it. And maybe I will just say a few of them, because, I've taken the time to learn more about what are these things? What is manipulative behavior? What is narcissistic behavior? What does it mean? What happens? So, just maybe some people don't know. So, but, these things were things that were mentioned, experiences that were shared. Like, for example, love withdrawal, that a teacher or, someone above you will, withhold affection and attention or approval, as a way to punish or manipulate you into changing your behavior. Now, everybody, might use something a little bit, but, we're talking about when it becomes extreme and damaging. Then there's shaming. There's a lot of shaming that makes you feel guilty or inferior for your, actions or your beliefs or, your behavior, but that just, just diminish your self-esteem. And they also make you more compliant. They often make you question yourself. They suddenly undermine, subtly undermine your confidence, and make you doubt yourself. And that often leads to more dependence on them for validation. And then there are, peacekeeping tactics where, the, leader or, the teacher may pretend to be, the neutral party when in fact they're secretly manipulating both sides of an argument just to maintain control. And there's emotional blackmail, using, your own emotions or vulnerabilities against you. There's many things, excessive complaining, constantly. There were many stories of this, complaining or excessive dissatisfaction to make you feel guilty for not meeting their unspoken or unrealistic needs. And very often there is, conditional love, that offering affection or approval only when you meet their expectations or comply with their desires, trying to make, they're so trying to make you show your love to them, overly exaggerating their problems, dramatizing their problems to make you feel responsible, spreading half-truths or rumors, telling others your personal business and then twisting your words. There's a lot, Now, whether, these manipulative type of behaviors, whether the person is consciously doing this or not, it can be or it cannot be. We all have some tendencies. Everyone has their own backstory. Why we are the way we are. But imagine how confusing these kind of messages would be for a young child. Honestly, I think it is very, very difficult for any adult, especially if you've never had any abuse in your own life, to actually comprehend the experiences of a child who is faced with situations that they have no way of processing or understanding. You know, that they are looking through a completely different lens. So, you know, I feel the best way to explain it is to hear firsthand from a woman. Her name is Madhavi. She said I can use her name. Who went to the school at a young age, and she wrote a very sad and very insightful poem explaining through the eyes of a child how she felt as she entered excitedly into the school, and then how she felt as she left. And again, you know, I offer my respects to this brave woman for sharing and helping us to understand what it feels like as a child. So I'm going to read that poem. I'm not so good at poems, but I am going to bring it up and I'm going to read this. And, you know, I say listen carefully to how she's expressing herself. So, I will read. 2 little feet stepped through the gate. Along 4 years she had to wait. My dream is real, this home is mine. A gleaming smile, she was just 9. Her hand was held, they walked within. Excitement bounced beneath her skin. Her daddy rang the doorbell loud. Though deeply shy, she stood up proud. Above the stairs, they thus were shown, a place quite soon to be well known. Inside she tiptoed, the floor was cold. She sat to hear her life unfold. With straw her little fingers played, while words upon the desk belayed. A new voice sung into her heart. Little she knew what was to start. Mornings came, she made little friends. Thus many nights too came to ends. She played and ate and learned with glee. But she was too small. She was small, so she didn't see. This place was different than others. Suddenly, she had 2 mothers. The little girl was innocent. Along she went. The voice that first sung to her heart on the day her life took a new start seemed to suddenly change its tone. Within those arms, she felt alone. What happened to this little one? Her new life only just begun. She hadn't seen what was to come. She forced her heart to thus turn numb. She gave her life, her existence, no fight or taint of resistance. To this voice her heart first heard sing, she gave this woman everything. She woke in the morning, took bath, fearing the touch of her wrath. Yet upon her glance she felt blessed, and just the same as all the rest. The sound within that singing voice thus gave that little girl no choice. To live and die for her alone, she forced her heart to turn to stone. Silence, that bold woman would scream. Such moments bitter-pasted neem. Yet that little girl grabbed her feet. Tears met the ground with her heartbeat. That blind child gave all her love to her new mother from above. And in return, she was told, that her heart was anything but gold. By her that little girl was cursed. She wished her all the worst. No friends, a husband who want to leave, cruel mother with children that grieve. And though such things were thrown her way, she still rose each and every day to please the woman, God knows why. Though impossible, still she'd try. A prisoner that small girl was, though bars weren't seen, and that's because the chains were deep within the heart. Same place touched at the very start. Though doors were open very wide, within the cell she wished to hide. She wanted not to be set free. She nearly loved insanity. Some people knew that things were wrong. They didn't like her much loved song. They wished to help her little heart. She felt it would tear her apart. She tried to hide her pain within. She seemed happy above her skin. And though she hated her life, there was everything for which she cared. That voice, the woman so selfish, she commanded her every wish. The girls are ants, she said with pride, and yet her faults they'd kill to hide. 9 years had passed under her care. Half that girl's life had been spent there. She's not good enough, always wrong. She's grown up hearing this same song. It's written in her heart with ink. She has no clue of how to think. She has been a sheep half her life. Say die, and she will grab a knife. 2 grown feet step out the gate. A long 9 years she had to wait. I'm useless, hated, and ugly. Now look. It's too sad. Now look at what you've done to me. Sorry. Phew. What a poem. Phew. Nobody can make that kind of stuff up. This is a testimony of an innocent child's heartbreaking experience. So now there's multiple cases. As far as I'm aware, all of this is not fully adjudicated, as they say. It seems the girl's case has not been completed in a satisfactory way. At least that is what some of them feel. But, you know, as you can see, this became a very complicated situation that still has not really been effectively dealt with. And the complexity of the situation was compounded by the fact that major changes were underway for the CPO, or the Child Protection, I'm not sure what it stands for, the International CPO. During this time, there were a lot of changes going on, and it made it very difficult to effectively deal with the situation. So suffice to say, it was a very, very difficult and confusing time, and it continues to be. But by late in 2022, an official statement came out confirming that Bhaktivijay Purna had repeatedly engaged in sexual abuse of a minor, as well as other forms of sexual harassment, emotional, psychological abuse of minors. and also in sexual acts with an adult woman. And that he admitted to some of these grave offenses. But, of course, the statement acknowledged that for such abuse to happen in our international headquarters and at the hands of a senior ISKCON sannyasi, must serve as a very, very loud wake-up call to all members. So by now, Bhaktivinoda Purna, he was finished. He had been in Mayapur since the very, very early days. He established, numerous things. But he was a very integral part of this project, and so he left Mayapur on his own. He cooperated with whatever investigation happened, and he left Mayapur. I don't know to where or what has become of him. So, of course, reactions to all of this, were very dramatic and polarizing, and there was tremendous anger, which there should be. If we're not, deeply, deeply disturbed by such revelations, we're not even decent human beings, what to speak of Vaishnavas. So, people were especially angry because of the prior investigations and allegations against Bhaktivinoda Purna in 80, 81, and then again in 99 or 2000. Why wasn't he stopped earlier? And, unfortunately, even when they're really good intentions, and really, people are well-meaning, but cases become so much more difficult to deal with and to understand or to help heal when devotees start just shouting out views that are either black or white. On one far end of the spectrum, there are those who, lash out in rage that just spreads everywhere, and it's directed against everyone and everything related in any way to the schools or Mayapur or teachers or leaders, GBCs, or anyone that was a friend, or, and, make extreme demands, that everything, close all the schools, stop the TOVP, no more ashrams, kind of get rid of everything, don't trust anyone. And although that kind of response is, it's understandable, it's not often very helpful. It really is not. And then you have others on the other far end of the spectrum are those who defend the abuser, who don't believe what has happened, or who try to minimize or rationalize it, or tend to downplay it. And they even, get into victim blaming. It's not so bad as they say. And they continue to support abusers who they believe have been wrongly accused, So, this is another narrative that really does not help. It really doesn't. And, both extreme views, they tend to just exacerbate the problems, While the majority of us, kind of watch from the sidelines, often feeling helpless and perhaps vacillating somewhere between these two extremes. But personally, I'm quite sure that there's no really sorting this out. What actually happened and when and to who and why it wasn't stopped, and because now there are just so many opinions and accusations and denials and so many ongoing disputes that truth seeking, it becomes almost impossible, especially when both sides of the spectrum often spread fake news about each other on official and unofficial forums. So everyone's trying their best to adjudicate, or we try to do what we can, reach out to those affected as far as possible. But for sure these are not cases that will ever be completed and tied up neatly in a bow. Much damage has been done, and I'm quite sure that there's so much that we will never know. And in saying that, I don't mean that, well, let's just forget about it, and move on. I mean, no, not at all. But what I mean is that perhaps the best way for most of us to deal with our anger and frustration is to channel it towards something practical, something doable. How can I help? What exactly do I need to learn from all of this in order to be able to be of help? And, why is it so hard to uproot abuse that happens? How does it get so complicated? And these are, obviously, these are very big questions, and, it's not for me to give the answers, that's for sure. There's reams of discussions going on about these topics, but kind of the only thing that I can do here is just share a few things that I've observed and learned over time, since I was on the CPT for a while and living in Mayapur for decades. So, there's no denying our painful failures as society and our systems, and each of us as community members hold some responsibility for the incompetence and neglect and ignorance that's caused so much suffering. But but I have some experience how it can be so hard to root things out and how it can become so complicated. So, I just want to mention a few things, not because I want to rationalize or excuse anything, but just to inform. It's helpful to know, what gets in the way. That we just have to know more, be more aware, and so I want to give a few points about how how it is difficult, not that it's not doable, but why it gets difficult. It's so difficult having done this, because a lot of people don't have the experience of working and trying to do something. It's easy to say, just get it done, But one of the reasons that it's just very hard to pin down and to actually get the proof that's needed to convict someone, just because we suspect it or we heard something bad happened, and, it isn't grounds for conviction in any court of law, so we can't just throw somebody out on hearsay. And, I'll give an example, my own example, my experience. when Bhaktividyapurna's case was revisited, I think that was around 2000. I was in the CPT at that time. My husband and I were on it, and although the international CPO was dealing with this, at some point, I don't know why, we were asked to interview him and given a list of questions to ask him. And so, 3 of us from the CPT met with Bhaktividyapurna. And, all of us had gone through training course, but, we're pretty new to interviewing. So I was silent for most of the interview. They were just supposed to, ask the questions there. So just listening and watching. And, what I saw, so Bhaktividyapurna was very cooperative and he behaved like a gentleman. He didn't show any signs of resistance or discomfort. And he, seemed to give somewhat logical or reasonable reasons why different things might have happened. But I was noticing that he tended, there was this subtle, tending, and he's very, very good at it, to minimize or to rationalize different incidents. So, it made me uncomfortable. And, I also noted, well, I don't hear him saying, he didn't appear to be sad or, saying sorry about things, So at the end, I thought, I have to, say something, So, I said, I think, that we would just like to hear you say that you feel deeply sorry, whether there are reasons for it or not. Under your watch, bad things happened. We'd just like to hear, that you feel really bad and are sorry about that. So basically I was putting words into his mouth that would be advantageous for him to say, and yet he did not say them. And that is such classic behavior, to not, say sorry, So despite my discomfort and my suspicion that there was, much more to the story, nothing further came out. No solid evidence. And it's frustrating, and the CPO also thought the same thing, but, we couldn't find anything more, So the result of that case was that, there was, I don't know the exact details, but there were lifelong restrictions put on him, and that, he wouldn't take leadership position, he wouldn't teach children ever, and he appeared to fully cooperate with that, and many people don't know, but, the next maybe 10 to maybe even 15 years, he was only engaged in adult education. And during those years, nobody made any more complaints. And, lots of devotees really loved his classes, and it appeared like he was complying. I'm just saying these things because people, why wasn't he kicked? Well, because it's hard. In retrospect, so now I feel so deeply saddened and, somewhat guilty. Could we have pushed more, or what could have, but the problem is that hindsight, as they say, is 20/20 vision. Since then, I've learned so much about identifying red flags, especially about emotionally abusive behaviors in spiritual leaders, that I have seen and that we do see, just a few examples because, maybe people are not looking, not seeing. So, there's a tendency that they create a cult-like following that will defend them when they're questioned. And now that was our experience. When all we did was an interview. We're just trying to be, do our job. We got hate mail from people, how dare you question, so these things happen. And then others that are really angry, why haven't you, done more? It's not easy, and that's what I'm trying to, it doesn't, justify anything. It's just for people to know that it's not easy, Another thing, these are things, that are well known, that there are, emotionally abusive, common, behaviors in especially spiritual leaders. They surround themselves with only people who praise them or fear them or submit to them. They view those who bring up, legitimate issues as enemies. And, they have to be the one ultimately in charge. And they have difficulty maintaining meaningful relationships with anyone, especially not in their chosen circle. And they're never wrong in the moment, and they never truly apologize. They are constantly promoting or reinforcing their own superior spirituality and greater maturity. Of course, they never say that outright because they know that spiritual maturity necessitates humility. So, they become masters at promoting themselves while wearing a mask of humility. And they talk a lot, but they listen very little. There's many signs, and, many more. And we should know them. The signs were there. But, we do what we can with the knowledge that we have at the time. There's just no point in judging the past with the knowledge that we have in the present. I think they call that presentism. It's not useful. And, so this is just one example of many of how it can be hard to really nail someone down, And then another thing that makes it very hard to root things out is that the victims are just not willing to come forward. They don't want to make a case. Or, maybe they come forward 10, 20, 30 years, even 40 years after. And I experienced this when we first were in the CPT. I felt like I really wanted to, there was so much uncertainty. I wanted to try to really dig in, try to uncover things that we heard had happened, but hadn't been, proof of it. And, we combed through some old cases and we did interviews, and we even sent someone out to, a village somewhere to meet with a former student to try to get testimony, but no way, he refused to talk, for many good reasons, So this is very common and very understandable, but it makes it very hard to get rid of a suspected abuser. Because the psychology of someone who's undergone trauma or abuse, they do not want, they're afraid, they fear reliving it, they want to forget it, they're afraid of not being believed or afraid of retaliation. They're riddled with legitimate fears, and they've maybe been rationalizing or denying or minimizing the impact of abuse for years, just in an effort to survive, and they are also, often there's a lot of confusion and guilt. Sometimes they think maybe I did something wrong, and then they're confused by the two faces of an abuser, because it's not all black. Sometimes they're very sweet and loving, other times they're the opposite. It's hot and cold, and nice actions follow an abusive incident, and they switch masks to punish and to comfort you. It's a cycle of intermittent emotional battery and resolution that keeps the victim like traumatically and biochemically bonded to the person, so they also, and then there's this feeling alone, am I the only one? Does anybody else see this? Maybe I'm crazy or oversensitive or making too much of it. And the feeling shame of it. We had examples of this in the very early days. There was a Sankirtan, girls' Sankirtan party that there was abuse going on there amongst a number of the girls, but none of them told each other, and many of them didn't know until years later. Because shame, guilt, blah, and even as strange as it may sound, affection for the abuser, but it's very common that it would be so much easier if an abuser looked like a demon with horns and pitchforks, but unfortunately they often have a side to their character that's deeply appreciated in a community, especially if they're a high-ranking leader. And that's something that's very hard for victims and very hard for people in general to understand, that a person can be many things. He can be an abuser, and he can also do tons of service and even be a good teacher. And not everything that they do is bad, and that makes it very, very hard. So I'm just bringing a few of these points up to show how hard it is for victims to come forward, and then consequently how hard that makes it to convict abusers. And another thing that kind of complicates things is the spread of misinformation. Now, here's another personal example. One day some visiting devotee came over and she was really upset, and she said she saw this person who is this mega abuser that was in the temple, and why is it allowed? And she was just really going on. And, I guess it would have been fine if everything she said was true. She thought she knew was true, but it wasn't, because I was very familiar with the particular case that she was talking about. I knew all about it, the details, and what she was saying was completely wrong. She heard it on Facebook, So, and then she'd been talking to many others about it, and everybody's getting all angry. But, it was just wrong. And I know that her intention was genuine, to stand up for victims. But, if you don't know fact from fiction, such attempts to, out someone can just cause a lot more complexity of problems. Yeah, we have to be vigilant. But, we complicate things and can cause more harm than good if we don't know what we're really talking about. So it is recommended that, before sharing any information about anything, it's a mature adult or a wise person, could go through what they call the 3-filter test. Is it true? Do I know it's true? Is it helpful? And, is it kind? So sometimes people trying to help make things difficult. Another thing that makes it hard to rid ourselves of, abusive situations is, really philosophical misunderstanding. As devotees, we are taught to see the good in others, to not find fault, and don't criticize and don't judge, and respect your elders. And this is really drilled into us. And it is all true. It is the proper practice of bhakti. But that does not mean we lose our discernment or that we ignore bad behavior. We really have to rid ourselves of the naive idea that because someone's a devotee, a senior, a sannyasi, a guru, whatever, that he, that person is just above suspicion. We have to know that even a devotee that's done huge service and may appear to be a wonderful devotee, he could also have done something wrong, and that statistics are there. And we have seen that, many times, that, some narcissistic, even psychopathic traits are really not uncommon as we'd like to think they are in spiritual teachers. Superficial charm and manipulativeness and lack of empathy. And, I'm not saying this all to, make everybody paranoid or disrespectful, but, we have to be mindful. And we have to be aware that devotees, everyone has different sides to their character. And, anyone, any mature adult, needs to look at the world with, one good eye and one bad eye. I heard that Prabhupada said that, but I haven't found it anywhere. But I hang on to that because that makes sense to me. It doesn't make sense to me that you can't think that anybody, that everything is perfect and everything is rosy. That doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, there are so many things in our Shastra where they tell us to discriminate. Don't, choose good association, teaching us what is a kanista, what is a majja. There's not like, it's not all one. We are asked to discriminate all the time, So, it's important. We cannot root out something if we can't see it, if we don't see it. So, Another thing, oh boy, this is actually getting long and I have a lot more things to say. I don't know, maybe it'll be too long. I don't know. Anyway, I'll go for a little bit longer. It says another thing is that that makes it hard is there's a tendency to hush things up. Now leaders are very often accused of doing this or, consciously protecting the abuser and not caring enough about the victims. And there are certainly instances in which this has been true and which has made justice difficult, But however, to be fair, there are other reasons for keeping things quiet that, have to also be considered. It's not surprising that if you're a leader of a project, knowing the possible negative impact, on a project, on communities, when cases of abuse come to light, the just openly outing an abuser can just have devastating effects. So it is kind of natural that they may want to keep it a little under wraps, especially if there hasn't been full, until there's a full adjudication has been completed. So, sometimes it's not like an evil design that they're trying to keep things quiet, but they're maybe thinking of also protecting others. And of course, every leader has to know that child protection is always the first concern, and the impact on the projects and people as a secondary concern, but it is a legitimate concern. And another legitimate concern for keeping things under the radar is that, often victims want that. Because in the name of speaking openly, we may inadvertently cause another kind of harm or hurt or abuse on those who are impacted by it. I know, maybe I won't get into that whole thing, but I know of cases where something small happened, it was made into a much bigger deal, and then it kind of, sort of made that person, that was their identity for, decades, instead of, some things should be kept quiet for various reasons. And also, the thing is that sometimes someone's done something wrong one time. They're not necessarily a monster. And so, if everything is said out in the open about such a person, there's just very little possibility for rectification, purification. And we do want that. There is always a tension between justice and mercy. We want offenders to, be prosecuted, but, we also want people to become rectified. Prabhupada often was very upset when devotees spoke openly about when somebody had difficulties. So, again, keeping things quiet, well, that it can be a problem in getting rid of abuse, but it also may sometimes be an appropriate way of dealing with it. It's not also the point of all of these things is not also easy. And another thing that complicates things is when all wrongdoing gets lumped into the same category. A lot of people that, really want to stop abuse, and all glories to that, But, often there's a tendency to just shout out how, ISKCON is just filled with pedophiles and people protecting them. And, this is ignorance, because this term, pedophile, it's bantered around so freely. It just seems, people just don't understand what that word means. It's a very specific term, and it refers only to one whose sexual preference is for children. And not everyone who has done an abusive act or made a mistake is a pedophile. So this tendency to lump all cases together as all the same thing, it's just, it's ignorant, it's wrong. It doesn't help justice to be served, When one gets trained in child protection, it's the first things you're taught are the wide categories of abuse that exist, from very mild to very severe, from the one-time offense to the chronic, lifelong repeat offender. And, so to understand abuse means to know that it takes many shapes and forms, and there are varying degrees of severity and varying punishments for that, and it's complex with unlimited, nuances and subtleties, exceptions, extenuating and aggravating and mitigating circumstances. This is the thing. If we want to stamp it out, we need to understand it. Not just shout about it. Because like I know someone who got labeled as a pedophile. He did do something wrong. It wasn't severe, and it was once, but it, you know, practically ruined his life and his family. You know, so we need to be vigilant, really vigilant, but we also have to be very informed. You know, but of course the biggest probably reason that it's very hard, you know, to stop all the things we'd like to stop is, you know, because it is very difficult to create, you know, lasting professional systems that can effectively deal with abuse across the whole ISKCON world, you know. And there's a lot of reasons why that's hard. And there are many who have tried, but, you know, we just have such a long way to go. There's just so much that's needed, especially, I think, more of it in the future would need to be local systems of accountability and confidential methods for reporting suspected abuse, training, educational systems. And, you know, the thing is, these are not really fun things to do. It's an austerity. I mean, when I went through that training of childhood, phew, it was not like my, you know, it's hard. It's hard to hear about all this stuff, and there's not a lot of people that actually want to do it, and then some people want to do it, but they're not good at it, or people don't stick to it because it's hard. You know, so, I mean, to be fair, our CPO, whatever we have, you know, so much has been expected of them. You know, it's almost impossible that they could do it all efficiently. You know, especially because they don't have the financial or the human resources to truly act as a judicial body, whether, you know, a civil, you know, on a civil or a criminal level. And to do that, there would, you know, you'd have to have, you know, trained detectives who could travel and do in-person inspections and interviews, and legal counsel available for both victims and suspects, and open questioning of witnesses in a real, you know, kind of court situation. And, you know, meanwhile, you know, our CPO, you know, they try to adjudicate cases with, you know, very small staff, paid for part-time work, and, you know, if we really wanted to have a CPO that could really do the full-on job, you know, that could do real justice to victims and suspects and perpetrators and our whole devotee society, then we'd actually need, you know, there would have to be massive funds put out, and you'd have to empower a true system of law, you know, which is really, you know, the province of kshatriyas and governments, you know. So I don't know, personally, I don't know what the future, I don't see those things happening. We're just not developed enough as a society, you know. So, you know, it seems like for now, we ask the CPO, you know, they're on a limited budget with super limited human resources to do, you know, kind of a government job that even sophisticated governments, you know, can struggle to achieve. You know, many people may not realize that even for one small case, you can have to spend dozens and dozens of hours, you know. And of course, different teams have tried to do their best in difficult situations and changing dynamics, and, you know, and also, you know, because of this lack of funds and everything, another big problem is in actually doing professional investigations. You know, we have seen many botched unprofessional investigations. We're so limited in ISKCON. And, we use whoever is willing to help and who wants to do the work. But even those with the best of intentions, they're not necessarily competent. Investigations are really not easy at all. And, I saw, like when we had problems here, you send one person for a few days to investigate a totally complex situation that's been going on for decades and well hidden, and, it doesn't work. It's not possible to get the complete picture. And investigations that are not done thoroughly and not done properly, they can really cause more harm than good. And I have seen that. I've seen it happen. Even though people are trying their best, non-professional investigations, they're often riddled with bias, and they can turn into witch hunts, or, they can reinforce power hierarchies in the organization or in the community. Real investigative process, it has to be driven by, facts and fairness and ethics, not fear. And there has to be integrity, not intimidation. All these things. It's not easy, and it can be very tricky. I've seen, I remember one of my friends who's very sharp and intuitive, she took part in an investigation, and I saw how that accused abuser just very subtly manipulated her into believing that he was innocent. And, then much later, even though they really tried to do their best, it was much later that they were proven wrong, So these things are tricky, So my point in all of this is, just to give a sense of how difficult, complex, ridding ourselves of abuse can be, In a large part of it is really due to ignorance and incompetence, But, of course, there are those that say, well, why don't we just turn everything over to the police? And indeed, that is what should be done in many cases, and I think that's kind of the policy now, but it's also not a pat solution. Many victims don't want that. They don't want to go to trial, and, complexities of the different policies, procedures, laws, statutes of limitations in different countries, especially if, the abuse took place somewhere, it's not so easy. And, I know that there are many, many devotees. They're trying their best, to create what we need. And I think the focus now is more on, local training, education, and prevention, and that's going on. So hopefully next generations, will keep and continue to work in this way. I'm not saying all these things to say it can't be done. I don't want to sound, overly pessimistic, but just, to know that it requires a real commitment, an institutional courage and individual courage to tackle it. And it's not somebody over there, it's everybody's responsibility, parents, community members, teachers, leaders, gurus, And it's not just that we need systems, that, if we just get a good CPO, my feeling is that the greatest need is for more personal care for victims and, dare I say, abusers. And it's not just about cases. Oh, we finished this case. It's about people who have to understand what happened and who need to learn why and how things have happened. People who need love and encouragement and philosophy, and most of all, Krishna. And this I see is hugely missing. I saw here in Mayapur, maybe, there's cases are being adjudicated, but there's a huge community that's been damaged. And, But, you know, we tend to just go on as nothing happened, you know, like the king's new clothes, you know, king's standing there naked, but we pretend he's dressed, you know. So there's just so much, you know, on an internal level that needs to be addressed. And that is a huge work, and it means being personal. It means caring, genuinely caring, you know, and that is a big challenge, you know. It's just not enough, you know, you hand down an injunction, you know, an email comes, you know, that states, you know, now you have to wear saffron or never, or white rather, or never give class again or something. You know, sure, we have to do all that stuff, you know, but that's not the end. That isn't the solution. Unless and until a person understands what happened in his own head, how it happened, you know, it's not over, you know. And, you know, also, you know, for victims, yes, they're happy to know that, you know, a case has been done, but, you know, healing and understanding, it's a long road that really requires love, guidance, encouragement, and, you know, much more, you know. So personally, I would just love to see a whole lot more of that. And it is happening. There's many devotees now, many devotees working on care systems. Karuna Care is doing wonderful things, and there are many others, you know, and so that is very, very good news. But it's a big work to help individuals to get through difficulties and, you know, come out the other side a whole and healthy human being that can then engage nicely in devotional service, you know. So it's like, you know, natural that we wonder, here we are, what can we do, you know, and you know, it's very easy and often there that we just shout revolution, you know. You know, John Lennon, his famous, you know, we all want a revolution. You say you have a real solution. Well, you know, we'd all love to see the plan. So, you know, shouting for reform without being the reform we want to see, you know, is another kind of cheating. And, you know, the advice and criticism are cheap. And even what I'm saying here, it really, it's also, it's cheap, you know. But, you know, it is easy to become fanatical and extreme in our concerns. You know, when especially we feel powerless to do anything. And we become very unsure where our, you know, sphere of concern overlaps with meaningful acts of influence. You know, because when we feel helpless, we tend to compensate by just turning up the volume on our concern. So we might, you know, kind of strong arm our views as if demonstrations of, you know, loud demonstrations of might are what will make something happen and might make something right. But, you know, it just isn't always true that might is right. You know, for many of us, it might be better that we just get quiet and listen and consider what is the best way for me to support or influence or be of some help. And that's often a humbling process. You know, it might be a lot smaller than we would wish of what we can do, but we also should not underestimate the power of small acts and small gestures. I've seen just doing a little thing for somebody, you know, how it's like invisible threads that gradually, you know, can work magic, or that can create, you know, a domino effect where bigger things can happen. You know, there is a subtle art of how to really make change happen. You know, if I try to force things, if I express my will thinking that it's my will that will make things happen, you know, it often doesn't go so well. But when we find the right thing within our own heart, when we depend on Krishna within our heart, then our will aligns more gracefully in execution of doing the right thing. So you can't put the cart before the horse. The will follows the right path, and the right path isn't made by my will. It's, So, if we're trying to plant seeds of future changes or growth, the seed, it comes, the best thing is that if it comes from the heart, from the super soul within. It's not reactionary, impulsive, domineering, or, hot-headed stuff, and that really applies to all that we do, that we pray to Krishna and we try our best, and we reach out in some way, however small it may be. And, of course, as parents, we want the best for our children. We want to create a happy and safe environment. And, it's natural. But at the same time, because there's been abuse, sometimes there is this other extreme that we go to. We swing to another extreme of overprotecting our children, or becoming kind of helicopter parents, constantly hovering, hyper-vigilant, and living in fear of every situation, or calling out abuse every time somebody does something that we don't like. So, that's another, reaction that can also be, damaging. So, we can't protect them at every second. But children, they're learning how to deal with life by watching us every day, how we deal with problems, how we deal when adversity strikes, and how we, live in the world. The most powerful messages are by our own example. So, we all want kids to be happy, but we know that's not a constant situation in the material world. We can't create a candy-coated life for them. We're in the material world. We're never going to root out all the bad things here. We're not going to change the nature of material existence. We'll never have a trouble-free institution. We can try our best, but there's real limitations. And it's best if our children understand this reality and that we try to give them life skills so that they will be able to cope when bad things happen, because they will. And of course, we know the best protection is knowing that Krishna is always with them in their heart, their true protector, and that even if something bad has happened to them, that they are pure spirit souls and beautiful and uncontaminated. So, no doubt as a society, we have a long way to go, but I see a lot of positive signs. The society is made up of people, of families, and healthy families make for healthy society. And I know that I see many really, really nice families now. Many kids that were brought up in Krishna consciousness, and they now have children of their own. And I see many wonderful devotee couples that are real responsible parents with just amazing kids. And many of them, they've learned to live a very balanced and Krishna conscious lives. Ironically, a number of them that I know went to the Gurukul and actually had good experiences. And because there were actually many very good things about that school for many years. So we have to be careful that in our desire to root out abuse, we don't, as they say, throw the baby out with the bathwater. But anyway, so despite all that I've said here, I think the future looks bright. I think many of the problems of the first generation will just disappear over time because devotees will be more mature, more developed, and the knowledge and the understanding of proper behaviors, it's just, known now, so much information. But, at this stage of life, I can't do much. I only pray that, the care for children and that educational development will take like total center stage in coming years, so that ISKCON will evolve into a safer and happier and more fulfilling place where everyone can flourish in their devotional life. And I truly apologize that this talk has gone on way too long. And probably I may offend someone by things that I've said. It's certainly not a nectar talk at all, but I don't even know if it has any value at all, or use to anyone. But I felt that it was necessary to spend some time on it. So thank you very much. Hare Krishna.